Hi, I'm Christopher Wolfe. I'm co-director of the Thomas International Center. One of the things we do is have interviews with fascinating people. And today we have Father Robert Gahl, who is professor at the Pontifical University of the Holy Cross in Rome, and who's done a good deal of work on contemporary moral philosophy. Welcome, Father Bob. It's really great to have you.
Thank you, Chris. It's wonderful to be here.
So let me start out by asking you, as somebody who studies the currents in moral philosophy today, what do you think the current state of moral philosophy is?
Well, the current state is one of great disarray, and I think materialism is dominant, especially in terms of how real people see their lives, and how real people, what they're acting for, and how they construct their own lives is about all around things of just mostly what's going to happen in the next moment in my life. They don't think enough about not just long-term plans in terms of this world and things of possession, but long-term plans in the sense of what kind of a life would they like to live.
Sounds more like anti-philosophy than philosophy.
Yeah, exactly. It is anti-philosophy, although there are some philosophers in the academy, in the universities, who have developed theories all around this, and some of them lead to really horrible things like eugenics, where if all you're focused on is material progress, for instance, you can take advantage of the elderly, the sick, the unborn, for the sake of scientific progress. And so materialism in moral philosophy might at first appear innocuous and simply nonsensical, but it can be really dangerous also.
Does this have something to do with the dictatorship of moral relativism that Pope Benedict XVI has talked about?
Actually, from the very beginning of his pontificate, the very beginning, the first Mass that he celebrated, in the homily, he spoke about relativism and the dangers of relativism. And he uses the term dictatorship because relativism can express itself in society as a kind of totalitarianism, according to which everything is allowed except for saying that certain things are simply wrong or simply evil. And therefore, to hold firm moral positions is excluded from the dictatorship of relativism. Unfortunately, that reflects a lot of features of our society today. That if you're judgmental of anyone or any kind of behavior, then you're excluded from polite society.
I get always struck by the fact that it seems to me moral relativism ends up making each one of us a god unto himself, because it means that if we can't really know objectively anything about morality, that nobody can tell us what to do, and we can simply make whatever decision we want to and go ahead and do it.
Well, of course, from a Judeo-Christian perspective, to make every man, every woman a god unto themselves is the first sin, the original sin, is to say, I want to be like God. But I think there's a sense in which it's even worse, because if you were to aspire to be a god and you wanted to take God's place, at least you'd be aspiring to something. But oftentimes this relativism, the way it's expressed in our society, is that everybody should just do whatever they feel like at the moment. So it becomes a very evanescent kind of experience where there's no point to anything whatsoever. And at least Adam and Eve were seeking something when they committed the first sin.
Yeah. I know you've done work on Alistair MacIntyre. Is the moral relativism you're talking about related to the emotivism that MacIntyre talks about in After Virtue?
Yeah, very much so. Emotivism is one of the moral theories that MacIntyre critiques, and then he offers a very constructive solution to it. And according to emotivism, the idea of emotivism is that the moral claims are simply an expression of preference on the part of the speaker. So that if I say that stealing is wrong, or adultery is wrong, or that one ought to pay their taxes, that would mean that I don't like it when people steal or when they commit adultery, and I like it when people pay their taxes.
Can anybody really live a life consistently that way, do you think? Really thinking that everything is morally relative? Because it strikes me that some of the strongest moral relativists I know can be extremely ideological about some things. Smoking, for example.
The example of smoking. There's also a lot of examples from environmentalism. There are people who hold that it's really important to recycle and to make sure that they set out their trash in the right bins, and yet they think that it would be discriminatory to hold that certain kinds of behavior that is traditionally held to be objectively immoral is such.
McIntyre lays out some kind of response to the situation of emotivism. Do you think what he offers is very valuable?
Well, McIntyre's his main book, most famous book, is called After Virtue, in which he lays out this critique and makes a proposal. The proposal he developed it further in other books, like in 3 rival versions of moral inquiry. I think the proposal is hugely important and relevant, and it's had a great deal of influence in philosophical scholarship.
How would you describe that proposal?
Well, he focuses on recovering, you could say, 2 major components from Aristotle. The first is that happiness is something to be achieved, and that moral philosophy ought to seek happiness, personal happiness, and happiness for as many people as possible, and that this happiness consists in a good life, and a good life is constituted by virtue, and virtue entails living according to friendship and being faithful to those friendships. In addition, McIntyre's proposal holds that things, including living beings, have a nature, and that nature is like a code that indicates how one ought to act. And if one acts according to that code, one can be considered an excellent example of that kind of thing. And therefore, to be an excellent human being is to have a successful life, and therefore that we really ought to live according to our nature. So he proposes recovering what's called natural teleology.
Why recover? What happened to natural teleology?
Well, natural teleology was thrown out by positivism and by Hume's law, we could say. So what happened with natural teleology is that philosophy...
what does natural teleology mean?
Natural teleology comes from the Greek telos, and teleology means that something has a point to it, that it has a purpose, and that purpose is inscribed in its very nature. Therefore, natural teleology. For instance, rain, water, tends to make things wet. And in making them wet, for instance, it can make the ground fertile, and it can make the crops grow. And that you could say is natural teleology. That Aristotle explains just things in the physical universe in terms of final causality. That final causality is much more perfect when it's raised to a rational level, where people actually set out and do things for a purpose that they intend, and therefore they make choices that they order towards an end. And if that ordering choices towards an end is in accord with their own nature, with human nature, then that would be a good kind of act and a good setting up of one's own life.
Okay, so why is it, do you think, that philosophy got away from natural teleology, rejected that approach to orienting ethics?
At the heart or at the origin, I think a lot of it had to do with nominalism, which was a doing away with a strong sense of formal or understanding of formal causality.
What's formal causality?
Formal causality is very simply that things are the kind of things that they are. For instance, that a dog is a dog, and that there's a caninity, being a dog, that there's a kind of quality about it that is perfective of that sort of animal. Whereas what nominalists do is that they say that if we call an animal a dog, we're just using a name that has a collection of properties that we use to designate that animal there, to distinguish it from a cat that has another set of properties. And nominalism leads to the rejection of things having a certain essence, and then the ability to claim that things ought to act in accord with their essence.
And then what happens with moral theory when you have nominalism becoming powerful?
When you end up with powerful nominalism in moral theory, you end up in positivism and legal positivism, which are the claims that the only thing that is binding in any way with respect to good or evil is that which was held by some authority and written down. And so therefore, if it's written in the code, or if the government said so, then you ought to do that. If they said you ought not to do it, then you ought not to do it. So it all depends upon what is written down, and this is the positive law.
Sounds like it's reducing right to might. The power of the law is what makes it right.
Well, there's no basis beyond the code. So, and if the authority who makes the code bases his own authority simply in his power, then might would definitely make the right. In fact, Pope Benedict is very sensitive to the issues of power in legislation. And at the same time, he's been advocating going back to this recovery of nature. In fact, when he spoke in Bonn before the German Parliament not too long ago, he said that everyone agrees in Germany today that the environment is something to be protected. And he said, well, why not consider that we human beings also form part of nature and therefore also have a kind of dignity and merit protection? And he used this logic to say that we need to get beyond and say that there's something prior to the power of the state government which protects the dignity of human beings. And of course, in Germany, this resonates especially deeply because of the experience of the Nazi regime that the Pope himself experienced personally, and therefore the importance of recognizing that there's something prior and in human nature that ought to guide laws that are established by human authorities and can determine before their existence on paper that they're just or not just.
So you think that Benedict XVI has had some interesting contributions to contemporary natural law?
Actually, just very recently, Pope Benedict, I think, has made some strong contributions also with respect to gender and with respect to sexual difference. And he's developed these arguments also in a way that I think are very much in tune with modern society, in that he expresses our appreciation for freedom and acknowledges that and says that freedom, however, needs to have a point to it, that for freedom just to be totally free from any kind of constriction or any kind of obligations would entail never making any commitments and never actually making any decisions. So it would be a freedom that would be vain, it would be empty. But instead, if freedom is understood as acting in accord with one's nature for the sake of a purpose, which is rooted in perfecting one's own nature, that's an authentic sense of freedom. And he used this analysis of freedom in order to critique gender theory and propose that human beings, in fact, are male or female, and that being a male or female has something to do with reproduction, and that human reproduction has a lot to do with marriage and with the family, and that these are values that need to be protected in society, and that they're interests, that it's the interest of the state, of government, to protect the family and to protect marriage.
So this focus on some conception of human nature, some conception of goods, to which freedom is ordered, is applicable not just to the private sphere, but has to be a factor in the public sphere as well.
Definitely. And it's since human flourishing is achieved and our happiness is not just all on our own. We don't just go and close ourselves in a room and say, I'll be happy and be all alone and make sure I don't make any mistakes. But we need to contribute to other people and to society and feel that we are contributing to a healthy society.
Well, I think a lot of people might fear that if the government gets into the business of somehow trying to shape or advance human flourishing, that they can do a lot of bad things with that. And some people would say, well, why doesn't government just confine itself to working on, basic resources that everybody can have access to without getting into the question of how people live their lives?
Actually, marriage is, again, a very interesting test case because in order to make a commitment that's also public to one's spouse, that's recognized by society, one needs to have some form of acknowledgement of some level of society. Need not be the federal government, it could be more local government, it could be the state government that would recognize such an agreement. So for the very basis of society, the family, for marriage, we have a moral need for government to intervene in some way to recognize these agreements and also to allow people to form contracts that are respected and protected under law. But of course, our freedom is, first of all, needs to be practiced individually, and the government ought to help us to order our individual freedom in such a way that contributes to the common good.
Yeah, I mean, it's striking that nowadays many people are very seriously raising the question of whether we really do need marriage for society. After all, why can't we just let people live, according to their own will, in any way they want, whether married or cohabiting or having serial relationships or whatever. How is it, do you think, that we can reestablish some understanding of the importance of marriage when it's under so much assault today?
I think one important approach is to look at it from the perspective of the right of a man and woman to get married, and the right that they have, a natural right that ought to be recognized by society to make such a commitment for the whole of their lives to one another. that's not just a private commitment that they make only at home, but that's recognized by society. One of the reasons why it's so important for it to be recognized by society is that they plan on having children. And the state, in fact, has an important role in protecting human life, from the beginning of human life until the end. And in fact, the state registers births through birth certificates, and the state also has a role in burials and in funerals. So the state exercises power over human beings in their embodied condition from the beginning of their lives until the end. And marriage has a key role within that context of generating life and nurturing life.
You know, speaking of births, one of the striking facts of the current world is the population implosion in the West. It doesn't seem to bother very many people. They don't particularly worry about what population is going to be, 50 or 100 years from now, or at least they don't worry about it when the population's dropping. They worry about it maybe if it's increasing. I guess I was struck especially by my last trip to Italy, asking some young people, well, don't you understand that Italy is not duplicating or replicating its population, that it's destined in the future to lose population dramatically, and won't that have a tremendous effect on what Italy is? And what was striking was just the lack of interest in the question, much less what the answer might be.
If you really go to the core of the issue, the problem regarding the demographic implosion in many countries, of course in Italy, in Spain, Greece, these are countries where it's especially serious and urgent. Some people, fortunately, are recognizing the problem, but it may be too late. In fact, there is no historical record of any society ever turning the corner on such a demographic implosion. But the core root of the problem has to do with hope and whether or not you're living for something beyond the present moment and beyond just material pleasure, if you're really seeking something transcendent. And in order to give life to another generation, you need to seek something transcendent and set your heart on something that's beyond yourself. In fact, when you think about it seriously, the risk of having children and even justifying seriously, rationally, having a child is a very serious commitment in terms of, well, will my child have a life that is worth living? Am I happy with my own life? And instead, what we see in many countries is a collective suicide, where they don't want to have children and they're not really happy with living their own lives. So there's this development in ethics today of generational responsibility, of looking towards the next generation and realizing that we have obligations towards them. Of course, this has huge implications also for government debt, like the federal debt that's growing so rapidly in the United States. But there's a German philosopher who's of the same generation of Pope Benedict, Robert Spemann is his name, who's recently published a treatise against the nuclear power industry based on this reason, this rationale of the responsibility with respect to the next generation and the lack of care that is currently in the industry being given to the nuclear waste, that there is inadequate attention to a definitive solution to dealing with the waste. They're all temporary solutions, kind of buying time, rather than saying, wait a second, we need to put these things aside in a safe place so that not just in 10 years or in 20 years, but in 200 years, it's not going to damage the future generations. I think there's an interesting logic to Spamann's critical proposal. There's the whole debate in the United States over the Yucca Mountain reserve or deposit for nuclear waste, which, from what I understand, its development has been canceled. So in fact, there is no plan strategically as to what to do with this waste. So his objection isn't based on anything regarding like the nuclear power in itself is evil, because of course it can be a very powerful tool and used very powerfully for the good, but it ought to be done so with responsibility also with respect to future generations.
Another good reason to hope for fusion instead of fission in the future.
Yes, in fact, that would be a responsible way of dealing with the next generation, developing technologies that would circumvent these problems as to what to do with the waste.
You know, your comments about children and hope rang a bell with me. I remember back when I was a graduate student and my wife and I were having our first couple of kids, and my dissertation director, wonderful guy, fallen away Catholic, commented about having children that in some ways it's making yourself a hostage to fate, because your happiness is so tied up with your children, and yet you, in a way, don't control what's going to happen to your children. And of course, from a perspective of a religious believer, you don't think it's fate, which gets us back to the topic of hope,
and providence.
Yeah, hope in divine providence.
In fact, human parenthood is, of course, a participation in divine parenthood. And therefore, one participates in God's providence by having children. And God, too, runs this risk. From a Jewish or from a Christian perspective, we can say he runs this risk of having his own children, we human beings, who do crazy things with the freedom that he gave us.
Yeah. I guess maybe the importance of hope is one reason why Benedict XVI directed his second encyclical in that direction, in Spe Salvi. He talked about this virtue of hope.
Yes, and it's interesting that how he uses the example of the martyrs as really the paradigm of Christian witness to our faith, and how the readiness to die for the faith is the strongest indication that one hopes for something beyond this life.
He also has comments, I think, about political philosophy as well, and the importance of hope over time as a kind of reaction to some of the trends of modern philosophy.
And that a society and a government actually takes concern for the future means that there is at least some semblance of hope on the part of those who have the responsibility of governance.
Yeah. Getting back to MacIntyre, again, I know you've studied MacIntyre, and one of his contributions is to discuss philosophy in terms of narratives. I wonder if you might explain to our listeners a little bit how he has developed that theme and why it's important.
Well, a real quick way why it's important, narrative, which is narrative are stories. And of course, we understand that stories have a big impact on us. For instance, when we read a book or watch a movie, they actually forge how we see what virtues and vices are. And we emulate characters whom we see in stories. This, I think, happens especially in terms of the movie screen, that one learns from them. But MacIntyre is also driving a deeper point, which is that the moral life has the structure of a story, and that each of us is, in some way, author of their own life story. So this has an important philosophical proposal, which is, if I'm the author of my own life story, is this a story that's worth living? Is my life one that's worth living? And why not be the author of a story that is worth living, which means that it can end up in a happy end? But the implication here is that there's a unity to our lives, that they're shaped by a plot, which gives unity to the whole story. So that every next week or tomorrow morning, I'll be the same person. It'll still be me. And the actions that I do ought to be directed towards that same end. So MacIntyre's proposal is one that overcomes what some philosophers have called the atomistic self, meaning understanding oneself in a way that is totally unbounded by place or by time, and by commitments and by relationships, such that we're not forged by the societies and the friendships and communities that we live in, but we're totally on our own, and we can totally make ourselves anew at any moment. But instead, MacIntyre's proposal is that we depend very much and we're shaped by our habits, and our habits are developed through practice. We acquire good virtues through practice and through effort, and by doing so we become capable of being the characters or protagonists in a story that will have a happy ending.
How do we deal with the fact, how does contemporary philosopher, has MacIntyre deal with just the fact of the depth of differences among people about what the ends of human life ought to be? That seems to be, for a lot of people, it seems to be a big issue of contemporary philosophy, that we have to live in a world where there's this tremendous diversity of deeply different views about what meaningful human life would be. And yet we still have to somehow live together. For many people, that seems to lead in the direction of, well, we somehow have to get away from letting those questions have any role in public life, because if we do, we'll just end up battling about them. We'll end up with something like the religious wars in Europe. And yet, abandoning any idea of the human good as a kind of directive principle of public life, also, that has problems as well. I don't think there is any such thing as a truly neutral society. So how do we deal with this problem of deep differences about what the meaning of human life is?
In fact, MacIntyre's analysis in his proposal is eminently stark. He's not one to dilute the differences that we have between these various philosophical positions. He emphasizes that you can't sort of make an agreement with a utilitarian or a materialist regarding what the moral life consists in. You have to go all the way back and reflect upon your very basic principles. Now, it hopefully in society, even if there are deep differences, hopefully we can reach some agreement regarding the principles. But that's the stark difference that with MacIntyre, that he holds that we need to think about those deepest original principles. And by deepest original principles, I mean things like, is human life a value that is always to be respected? Is marriage something, and marital fidelity, something that is respected in society or not? I think those are the deep issues. Like, are we to order society according to a good? And does good mean respecting human beings as persons?
Yeah, many people seem to want to cut off the conversation as soon as you get to the point where people disagree about whether marriage is so important, or they disagree about exactly what human dignity means, or when it kicks in, or whatever. You know, those differences should somehow short circuit the conversation rather than serving as a stimulus to it.
Well, one of the proposals of MacIntyre, which is a very practical one, you could say, in the meantime, we have these great disputes, and we probably won't be able to resolve them tomorrow. So what do we do in the meantime? And he proposes forming small communities of getting together with people with whom there is agreement about these basic principles, and forming a society, which may be a small group, it may be a school, it may be a group of homeschooling families, it may be a group of families who get together and in order to shape the character of a particular school that they have. It could be a charter school, it could be some other form of private school, in order to convey these values and these virtues to their children.
Well, that makes me think of a problem that I'd like to get your comment on, something I've been thinking about recently the last couple of years. You know, we have a culture in America, a broad culture, and yet something we share in common that makes us distinctive perhaps from other cultures. And yet it's striking how deeply divided America is right now, that in some sense we're, you know, two cultures, let's say, you know, the red culture and the blue culture, so-called. And those cultures are so deeply different that, you know, depending upon who's in control of especially the political mechanisms of society, there can really seem to be a threat, you know, that the other subculture views. Well, let me talk about it practically. If the Reds win against the Blues really fear that they're going to have, you know, some kind of Iranian Ayatollah-like revolution shoving religion down their throats. If the Blues win, you know, the Reds are really concerned that religion is going to be entirely shoved out of public life and put at a disadvantage in different ways. And that it does seem that these differences are so great that it's tough to have a kind of feeling that there's an American consensus, that there's a basic civic friendship that will kind of take us through. And that's true on both sides, I think, that there are people on both sides of the cultural divide, the more traditionalist or the more modernist, a lot of people who feel this way. And there may be some truth to it, in fact. I just think of the HHS mandate and, you know, the way in which certain things are being imposed on religious believers. Really, they're being compelled to do things that are contrary to their conscience. Now, the question that raises for me is this: is it going to be increasingly necessary for people to establish very strong subcultures in which, in some sense, they withdraw from the more general community in order to protect their identity and to live in a subculture kind of apart from the general culture? And yet, you know, on the face of it, that's something that we as Christians would seem to not want to do, right? Because we want to be part of the general culture, helping to transform it. So how do you handle this, in some sense, protecting yourself from potential threats from the general culture by establishing a strong subculture, while at the same time not withdrawing from it, but still being a part of it and trying to engage it and transform it?
Of course, there's this early writer, he wasn't even Christian, but he was commenting on Christians and how they were living in society, who said that they were like the soul within the body, the way the soul is everywhere within the body. And he was admiring this and saying how they were at the same time very strong in their belief, and yet they were fully citizens of the Roman Empire, which is exactly the sense that Christians aspire to inform society and to order society according to Christ, really. The whole of society, even if society is principally pagan. So if they see that there is a need to withdraw in a sense, even temporarily, they would see that as a kind of loss of an opportunity of informing the whole of society. But I would hope that much of this conflict between red and blue and really fundamental philosophical disagreement in politics today in the United States could be resolved through some form of subsidiarity. However, when I say some form, certainly a facile solution is not ready-made because like the example you gave, the HHS mandate, in fact, it's an invasion of subsidiarity. It's an imposition from above. And by from above, I don't mean that the authority is necessarily higher, because according to the proper understanding of subsidiarity, the authority that is higher is like the mother and father of the family, not the federal government. So the authority is higher because it's closer to nature. In fact, as we know from the founders of the United States, the American founding fathers, that the government is of the people and it's by the people. So it's a government that receives its authority, in part at least, through consensus. So if some form of subsidiarity that would reestablish this legitimate autonomy of the smaller levels of society, lower in the sense of smaller levels of society, I think is necessary in such that there's states that could have more significant differences, like with respect to sex education in the schools, which there already has been recently. In Texas today and in Massachusetts, what is considered sex education is very different in the public schools. And I think that kind of variety may be a pathway to solving some of these tensions between red and blue.
I know a lot of conservatives actually have invoked that, and they say that the way to resolve these differences is through federalism and by devolving issues down to states and localities. One thing I think that doesn't really handle very well, though, is the cultural question. That is, we have a broad culture that's shaped to a great extent by Hollywood, by movies, by TV, by bestsellers, New York as well as Hollywood perhaps. And those cultural forming institutions aren't something that can be easily limited to one state or another. Another example would be the problem with pornography. I mean, it's very difficult to know these days exactly what a particular isolated state could do about that, or even these days a nation could do about it, given that the sources are often international as well as national. So how do we deal with the cultural problem that seems to really transcend any kind of issues of federalism, where as much as you'd like to have subsidiarity, you're dealing with a reality? I mean, in this case, subsidiarity says that a function has to be performed by the lowest level of community that can perform it adequately. Well, of course, if you have a national problem with respect to cultural formation, then perhaps it's going to have to be a national solution. The question is, how do you deal with that cultural problem? Because it's hard to imagine really doing it through, government or legislation, for example.
I would formulate the principle of subsidiarity a little bit differently. So I mentioned that in Centesimus Annus, John Paul II was an encyclical on social doctrine. He enunciates principle of subsidiarity. And he does so in such a way that it's not meant simply for efficiency. It's not an instrumental, useful kind of principle merely. It is useful too. But that the lower level ought, rather than saying the lower level ought to take care of it if they can, it's more that the lower level should relinquish its own vested authority to take care of it insofar as it cannot take care of it, and then ask for help from the higher level. So there's a sense of the lower level asking for help from the higher level. It's just a little bit of difference in seeing the direction in which, so you start from the bottom, and the bottom is the one that's really vested with the authority. And if they can't take care of it on their own, which is exactly the case you're mentioning, like with respect to culture, pornography, Hollywood. In fact, it's not just a federal issue, it's worldwide, definitely. And I've been living in Europe, in Rome for years, and everything that's American in terms of culture immediately has an impact. I've also spent time in Africa, and the impact is immediate and direct everywhere around the world, things that are produced culturally in the United States. So while we have this challenge, which I think can in part be solved through subsidiarity, it's not enough on its own. We also have to deal with the whole world globally and try to transform the culture. And I don't think the solution can be through it's not simply through passing new laws, but it has to be through personal conversion that's transmitted to other people, also through forming these communities of virtue. So one person can't do it all on his own. It's not just a speech, but it's communicating values that can be lived out as a witness of a life that's actually lived.
Well, thanks for talking with us today, Father Bob. It's been great to have you, to hear about some of the current trends in moral philosophy and the ways of perhaps dealing with those from a Christian perspective. I hope you've enjoyed our interview today, getting this different perspective on current problems. I'm Chris Wolfe of the Thomas International Center. Thanks very much.